Welcome everyone to our webinar. And if we've got lots of people here returning from the other night and returning from other events that we've had, so welcome back. And if this is your first time with us, a big welcome. Just a quick 30-second spiel on who we are and how we came to be. The three of us, Matt, we've all taught together for a few years, and we are an educational startup, and we really focus on or try to provide opportunities for all of us to learn, and as Mike suggested, as a community. So we do take a little bit of a different approach, and we think there are other ways to learn other than just the traditional, going to conferences and having PD days and things. So webinars and podcasts we're big into as well. So if you haven't subscribed to our podcast, Teacher Talking Time, in iTunes or Google Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts, and really just building a community and a network where we all can throw ideas around. And as Mike said, we'll use that today as we do our webinar and share some documents with you and use some breakout rooms and really get, and in the chat, of course, to get everyone involved. So I hope you enjoyed, and welcome again. And I guess, Leo, let's get cracking, huh? As soon as he unmutes his
okay,
mic.
all right. I was coughing here. Well, welcome everyone. I think we're going to start with a little warmer. So I'm going to ask everyone to go on this website, www.menty.com. And once you get there, I would like you to type in the code, which is this one right here, 226933, just so we have a better idea of what everyone knows in terms of, what people know in terms of language awareness. I'm going to go there just so we can see what everyone is saying about language awareness. So this is the question that I posed. The question was, a student has asked you to explain a difficult point of grammar, which you are not absolutely sure about. So what do you do? A couple of options here. The first one, let me maximize this a little bit more. So the first one that we have here, you can use your intuition to give the best answer you can and consult a reference book later to confirm your explanation. That's an option. So we have 7 people saying that they would do this. The second option here, use your intuition to give the best answer you can and consult a colleague later to confirm your explanation. Nobody has voted for that. We also have here, consult a reference book before giving an explanation. We have 5 people who have said they would do this. 0 people have said that they would consult a colleague before giving an explanation. And nobody said that they would actually use their intuition and give a but answer. That's good. That's good. We have a lonely voter here. And I'm going to send you to the next question, which is the following. When you think about the word language awareness, what comes to mind? So you can actually just type in there just so we have an idea of what you, what your schema is in terms of language awareness. Okay, context. Okay, structure, all right. See what else people are going to say. Ooh, some good terminology here. Okay, pragmatics, metacognitive awareness, pronunciation, context, structure, content. There's a lot of content so far. Yeah. Oh no, content and context. Okay. Ooh, teacher's development. Okay. Okay. Consciousness, pragmatics. Ooh, answers keep popping out. Okay, let's see. Context seems to be a very an important word here, keyword here for all of us. Guided discovery, I like that. Pronunciation, language through language. Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, I think we have an idea. I think before we jump into the session aims, I have a preamble here. I think experience and awareness of potential pitfalls may have taught a lot of us the benefits of caution, especially when we're answering a question about language. And I would argue that this leads us to take prudent steps of deciding to defer a response so that we can kind of buy ourselves some thinking time. Like, oh, that's a very interesting question. Or, so part of this strategy also could be referring the problem back to the individual student. Like, what do you think, right? So inviting, we can also invite other students to contribute to the problem solving activity. What do the rest of you think while you're still buying yourself some time? Meanwhile, while students are thinking about the answers, we could be racking our brains to work out our own answer. And if our antennas have warned us that a question is somewhat really tricky, what we might want to do is we might well decide not to commit ourselves to an explanation there. And then what we could do is we can perhaps provide a more carefully considered reply, such as, oh, let me think about that and get back to you in the next class. Very often, however, we end up improvising a response. And I would argue that we may do so for a variety of reasons, and often without being fully aware of them. So some of us, not all of us, but some of us, there might be times when we make a conscious, principled decision to exploit that learning opportunity, and we aim to provide the learners with knowledge at a moment when we sense that they may be especially receptive. And now I'm going to use some contemporary jargon of second language acquisition. We might think that our response to the learner's problem may trigger a restructuring not only of the interlanguage of that specific learner, but also potentially the interlanguage of everyone else in the class. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is, by explaining or answering that question to one student, we might think that we're helping everyone else. But the reality is we don't know if the other students are at the same interlanguage development as other students. So, but for the majority of us, I would say, especially the ones who are here today, the reasons are likely to be less sophisticated and perhaps skillfully calculated. So particularly when we are not so experienced, and as most of us are, we're probably all very streetwise. Oops. Let me go back here. So we may improve out of a misplaced confidence or naivete, perhaps simply because our instinct when we are asked a question as teachers is always to try to be helpful and provide a response, or improvise for the opposite reason, out of fear, out of a lack of confidence. Perhaps a lot of the times when I have talked to teachers, they have said that they're worried that their students will judge them to be incompetent or deficient in some sort of basic knowledge if they don't provide their students with an on-the-spot solution to the problem. So we may be afraid that we will lose face as a result, rather than perceiving ourselves as, or perhaps using what we said in the beginning, this delaying strategy. And I want to start with a quote by Michael Swan, and I'm paraphrasing this here. I don't remember exactly the words, but he said that good teaching is at the heart a mysterious feat, because we're standing, so to speak, on the listener's shoulder. And we're monitoring what people are saying with our ears, and using this feedback to shape and adapt one's words from moment to moment. So what's happening is this thread of communication in the classroom never breaks. And this is why I think teaching is more an art and not so much a science. So that was Michael Swan, and I think it was from an article he wrote back in the 90s. So having said that, let's jump into the session. I want to maximize this here. All right, I think we're good now. That was a bit of a long preamble, I should say. Okay, so the main aim of this session is to provide everyone with a bare bone understanding of language awareness and language knowledge, as well as the importance and relevance for both language teachers and learners. Some of the session outcomes, things that we hope everyone will leave this session with. You should be able to have a clear grasp of what is meant by having language awareness. You should be able to understand the different types of knowledge, and we're gonna harp on this for a little while, and how they apply to second language acquisition. We're going to analyze and identify the benefits of language awareness for both language teachers and language learners, because we will argue that there are benefits for both. We're going to ask you participants to reflect on your current level of language awareness, and more importantly, giving considerations to the limitations, because there are limitations to language awareness in the classroom. So let's jump into our first warmer. So I'm going to ask everyone to really think about these questions, because I'm going to send you into breakout rooms so you can actually start talking. So the first one is, what does language awareness mean to you? We kind of already talked a little bit about that. But the second question is the one that I want to focus on here, which is, where does your knowledge about language actually stem from? Okay, where did you learn about language? And in what ways, if any, does theory influence your own teaching and the kinds of decisions that you make in the classroom? Okay, so we'll start with that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to send everyone into breakout rooms. How many people? 25. I'm going to do 5 breakout rooms. There you go. And I'm going to give everyone 5 minutes. So please do not talk for more than 30 seconds each. All right, here we go. So you should receive an invitation to join a breakout room.
I don't know about other people.
Yeah, I would say similarly. I've been teaching for quite a while. I started teaching young children. So I think even getting into language and context started there for me.
I suppose that's a good starting, but what age group do people tend to teach? I'd be more secondary and adults.
There's no conversation happening in this room.
Oh, that I don't know. There was another page here, so I think that's why people were silenced. I don't know. They seem to be off with the mic.
Oh, well, you can tell me. I mean, where did you?
Marcio. And I started teaching. Just happened to teach, and then I really got into it. And basically, I prepared
I have searched through books, um, articles that I have read when I was at the university, and then, for example, uh, events that I take part, books that I buy. So I try to read as much as I can. So we're not going to be specialists in everything, but we have to have a little bit of different knowledge.
Right.
This is knowledge regarding the language because it's something really broad.
Absolutely. No, I think what you said is key, that we don't have to be specialists. And I think this is the thing, as a lot of teachers think that they need to know everything about language, but I think what you said is true. I think we need to have a very, very good knowledge of the language and about the language and a certain level of language awareness, but it's not required that we know basically everything. And if you have a question, something that we don't understand, I think it's always okay for us to say to a student, hey, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll get back to you. I think this vulnerability is important.
Yeah, it's great because we show students that we are human beings and we don't know everything. And we show them that despite the fact that we are teachers, we are constantly learning. So it's not like an end, it's not a fixed process, for example, that you have a start, a middle, and you have the end. No, it's something that is for the lifetime.
Yes.
And for example, we must have lots of different books. So according to the necessity, we go and flip through in order to get the response and the knowledge to share with students and to guide them.
Absolutely. All right, let's move back to the session.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So I think everyone is back. I'm just going to continue. So let's move on to the second part. And this is we're gonna do this via chat. Just otherwise, because if we don't, we're gonna be here for the next 4 hours. So this is a different warmer. And Mike, you said we wanted to do this differently. We want you to basically type in the chat.
Can you share your screen, Leo? Sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
We have to redo it every time we come.
Yeah, okay, let me go back here. Okay. All right, so here. So yeah, we said we're gonna do this via chat. So perhaps think about some of these actions. For example, asking students to work out a rule from an example sentence, or asking students to make up sentences using a previously taught vocab or new vocab, focusing mainly on fluency, or explaining grammar rules. So perhaps you could choose a few of these things, a few of these actions that you perhaps do every lesson, and things that you do in some lessons, and perhaps things that perhaps we could focus on every lesson, and things that you never do in your lessons, just so we have an idea of what people are doing. So I'm going to open my chat here. So yeah. So how often do you do the following in your classes? So pick things that you do in every lesson. For example, one thing that I never do is I never explain a grammar rule in English. That's something that I never do. Something that I do every lesson. Oof, that's a good one. I let the students choose the topics they want to use in class. That's something that I often try to do. This is something that we do through a needs analysis. Perhaps, I think I'm interested in this one here. How many of you perhaps correct oral errors as soon as they arise? I'm also interested in the balance that everyone is trying to strike between fluency and accuracy. We have a couple of responses here. Let's see. Michael said he agreed. Oh, problem solving. Okay. Sandra said that every lesson, she asks students to make up sentences using new vocabulary. Okay. Choral drill for pronunciation. Okay. Focus mainly on fluency. That's good. Kelly said drilling. Sharon said it's a bad thing to explain a grammar rule in English. I don't think it's a bad thing. It's not something that I expect my students to be able to do. I don't think that reciting grammar rules in English will actually help them communicate in the language. Rebecca said every lesson, make up sentences using it. So everybody seems to be on the same page when it comes to actually having students write their own sentences using new vocab. Roberta said, I never correct oral errors as soon as they arrive. Okay. Oral errors sometimes, but much more emphasis on fluency. Yes. Danilo said some lessons he uses problem-solving activities. Elaine, correct oral errors as soon as they arise. Never, she never does that. Danilo said he always corrects oral errors. So you see, we have a difference here. Some people say that they never correct errors as soon as they arise, and some people say that they always do that. I'm wondering what the rationale is behind your ideas. Like, why do you do it this way? In other words, why do you do what you do, right? Mary said, I never correct errors as soon as the students makes them. She just follows them up. Mike says, grammar rules are meta language. That's true, Mike. Michael, yes, another Michael here. Try to repeat the sentence in the correct way. So yeah, a little bit of reformulation from Roberta. Lorenzo said, error correction with different kinds of feedback. Okay, there's a lot of answers coming out.
Mars, you have a
Mars,
good point here about tasks. So it depends
okay.
on what the task is. So that's
yes. If the task focuses on fluency, then we should let them make mistakes. But if the task focuses on accuracy, yeah. Sharon says she picks her battles. Some I correct, some I don't. I think one of the, and I think I had this, it was one of the podcasts that we had with Brett Reynolds, who argues that collocations are a form of native speakerism. I'm not going to go too deep into this. But I would suggest that if the mistake is, if what students are saying is intelligible, I think we should aim for intelligibility. If you think that what students are saying will, if you think what students are saying or the mistake that they've made is something that would not affect comprehension, then I think we should kind of like let that pass. But if it's a mistake that will cause some sort of misunderstanding, then I think we should correct. Michael said, delayed feedback for the sake of fluency feels better. I agree, Michael, I agree. But feedback is as effective if distant from the moment. I agree. So you see, that's the problem. If we do a delayed feedback, then the students are going to say, oh, I don't remember saying that. Well, we said that at the beginning, but yeah. Okay, good. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your participation. Let's move on because we still have another 300 slides to get through here. So let's go to the next part here. Michael, you want to talk about this very quickly?
Well, it's just more or less, oh, sorry, I think, yeah, just more or less a reflective task, as it says, to just, as we go through this presentation, just, you know, just consider your own experiences. Definitely my first breakaway group, we talked a little bit about this, our experiences as a learner, our experiences as a teacher, and our own life experiences, and how they've kind of informed our own teaching and our language knowledge and language awareness, right? And basically just, yeah, we just encourage you to think a little bit about this as we proceed through this, so you can internalize it and relate it to your own context.
Okay. Yeah. So we're going to get to language knowledge now. So I have a little task for everyone. You can also type your answers in the chat here. So it's going to be about kinds of knowledge. So we're going to look into this. So what kind of knowledge do you think a person needs in order to succeed in the following? Let's say if you want to get an A or a B plus on a history test, what kind of knowledge do you need in order to play tennis, or baking a cake, or riding a hoverboard, or sinking the free line shot in basketball? So what kind of knowledge do we need to succeed in these real world activities? Let's see. So Michael said history we need, I'm gonna type it here. So for this one, Michael said factual knowledge, recall, interpretation. Okay. A lot of theory, right? Yes. I think that's where the knowledge of grammar comes into play. So a lot of theory. Baking cake, you have to be able to follow instructions. Yes. But what kind of knowledge do you need to bake the cake? right? Somebody said experience. Well, yeah.
Experience doing it, maybe.
Yeah.
That's what they think.
Experience like by doing it, right? Okay. What else? Practical. Yeah. So numeracy. Oh, okay. For which one though? For the history test? Procedural.
Well, the baking.
For the baking, yeah.
Yeah,
well, we
definitely.
heard. I heard a good word here. I'm going to write this one because I think Lorenz is on point here. Procedural knowledge.
Oh wow!
He's
Someone
already
read the
ahead of
notes.
us.
Someone
Yeah.
read the notes.
Yeah, this is just to get you guys thinking more, everyone thinking more about the different types of knowledge that we're going to be talking about here. I'm going to move on, and I want you to think about this. How might the following people actually acquire language? So let's think about a baby communicating with its parents. Let's think about a migrant worker using English as an additional language in the workplace. And the third case would be a student in an intensive ESL course. How would these people acquire the language? So I'm going to write some of the answers here. Baby, people said imitation. Okay. Yeah, some people are on point here. Repetition. Yeah. Repetition, imitation. Okay. Listening and imitation. Yeah. So listening. Kelly said body language. Yes. We're forgetting about that. A lot of body language. Enough exposure to spoke. So yeah, exposure. Yes. So we have another keyword here. Exposure to the language. Marcia said TPR. I don't know if the baby knows what TPR means, but I know what you mean. I'll write that down. Total physical response. Okay. Yes. Gil or Jill said they need exposure to the language. Yes, Mike.
No, I was just going to say, I don't know what people would say if they just saw a screenshot of this. It was basically we have exposure, total physical response, exposure to the environment. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so it's a lot of exposure. Attitude. Attitude. Somebody said attitude. Okay, attitude. Attitude could be rephrased as motivation, perhaps. Yeah. Okay. A lot of exposure. Okay. Okay. Let's move on. Let's get to the two types of knowledge that we're going to be talking about now. So the knowledge dichotomy. So we're going to look at two types here. We're going to look at, in second language acquisition, we have what we call an interface position, which basically talks about the relationship between two types of knowledge. And I think Lorenzo was the one who kind of hinted at it. We have what we call implicit knowledge or procedural knowledge. And on the other side, we have what we call explicit knowledge or declarative knowledge. So an example of this would be a native speaker of Spanish conjugating verbs versus me conjugating verbs in Spanish. I think ideally you would say that I probably have knowledge of the grammar in Spanish. Therefore, I'm able to verbalize. In this case, I have very explicit knowledge. I can explain to you how to conjugate verbs in Spanish. I can explain to you certain things in Spanish. However, a person who is a Spanish speaker, let's say, probably doesn't have this knowledge, and they're able to communicate in the language, they're able to speak the language, they're able to conjugate all those verbs in the language, but they're not able to verbalize that. So they're not able to explain. And a good example of this, and this is not in the slide, is walking. When we think about walking, do we have implicit knowledge of walking or do we have explicit knowledge of walking? I would say we have implicit, right? I mean, if you ask someone, excuse me, can you explain to me how you walk? I mean, it's basically impossible to verbalize, to explain, to have the knowledge of how your body moves from one step to another. So this relationship between implicit procedural knowledge and explicit and declarative knowledge in the mind has been the primary focus of second language research. So let's look at the explicit knowledge very quickly here. So Goodman describes explicit knowledge as what he says here, conscious. It's something that you're able to think about. So it's knowledge about the language. The declarative knowledge in this case would be of phonology, of sounds, of lexis, of grammar, of pragmatics, of social critical features of the second language. In other words, these are things that are conscious, things that are learnable, and things that are verbalizable. And this has to do a lot with the language that we teach in the classroom. Especially, I don't remember who said this, but somebody said that, why do you think we shouldn't teach students grammar? Because I don't expect my students to verbalize grammar. I expect them to be able to produce the language without thinking too much about the grammar. And the interesting thing about this, and this is something that Ellis also suggested, is that a lot of this is accessed through controlled processing, right? When second language learners experience some difficulty in the use of the language, they're able to revert to this knowledge and then be able to use the language in this case. So, for example, when we say the window was broken by one of the guys, many people would not know, especially if you are a native speaker of English, they would probably not know that this is a passive construction. And the other day I was talking to my daughter about this, and my daughter is a very good example of a person who doesn't have explicit knowledge of the language, and she constructed a sentence using a very complex passive construction. And I said, wow, you just used the passive voice. And she said, the what? Because she doesn't have this knowledge about the language. And to go back to the point earlier in our chat today, I think we have to think about this. In the classroom, do we want our students talking about the language, or do we want our students talking in the language? I think that's the question that we need to be asking ourselves. If we focus too much on grammar, what our students are going to be doing is they're going to be talking about the language. But what we really want is we want our students to be talking in the language, not thinking, oh, I have to use the present perfect here and now. And a question that I'm going to throw to everyone out there who's listening or watching this is, when was the last time you had an entire conversation using only the simple past? But that's the kind of task that we ask our students to do in the classroom. Okay, so we present the language, we practice, and then we expect some production at the end. And then we ask our students, okay, now I want you to use the simple past in a conversation. But when was the last time you had a conversation in English when you employed only the simple past? Right? So the learner can apply the rule, but it can also state the rule when they're applying. Right? The example is that they're not only constructing a correct sentence, but they can also explain how it is formed. And that's the explicit knowledge. So moving on to implicit knowledge, let's go to the next slide. It's the knowledge of the correct form without the ability or without that conscious effort to state what the rule is. So the learner may be able to produce that example sentence without being able to explain why the first verb phrase is formed with will. For example, I will come if you like. And the second with a simple present tense. Right? So with this implicit knowledge, which is at the core of task-based language teaching, is what we expect students to do is we expect students to talk in the language. But when we use a PPP approach, we're expecting students to most of the time talk about the language with knowledge of grammar. So this is why I find that starting with the task, okay, here's a task. Just talk to your partner about your weekend and perhaps find two things or two similarities between activities that you both did this weekend. Students are forced to talk in the language as opposed to saying, let's have a lesson on the simple past. Here are all the verbs in the simple past. Let's do some drilling. Let's do some gap fill. And then, only then, they have to talk about their weekend. I find that what happens is this. A lot of the time is students are going to become a little, the language becomes a little contrived. It becomes a little, I think the word I'm trying to say here is students don't have the freedom to just communicate and make mistakes in that sense. So, which leads me to the burning question. Actually, not one, but a few. The first one is, what kind of knowledge about language do language teachers need? Why is knowledge of this kind is important? how does this knowledge or the lack of it affect language teachers' handling of language-related issues in their teaching? And what sort of knowledge about language do our students need? And how does this knowledge or the lack of this knowledge affect their production? I think these are questions that we don't have to answer them right now, but we hope that throughout the session, you are thinking, you are reflecting, because I would argue that teachers need to have this knowledge about the language. Teachers need to be able to talk about the language. Learners don't need to talk about the language. What learners need is they need to talk in the language. I'm going to pass it on to Michael now, who is going to take over. Mike?
Sorry, I'm just loving the chat right now.
Oh, I can't follow the chat.
I know, no, you're right. It's too difficult to do both. It's and it's
any
both
comments?
Both are equally captivating. Yeah, like I think one of the issues that we're talking about in the chat, definitely Sandra and I were talking about, was yeah, this idea of exposure, right? And that it's not always easy for teachers who are teaching, say, the English as a foreign language. So unlike us, so I don't, Leo, Andrew, and I teach in Canada. We teach people who are living in Canada, who are learning English, surrounded by this English-speaking environment. And I think it's a valid point, right? That that if you're teaching, say, English in Brazil, and they're using it as a foreign language or an additional language, and it might be, it's not as easy for them to get that regular exposure that they need. And I think it's a very good point.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, I have my own kind of other take, but I'll let you go first, Leo. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, because I was reading what Roberta said here. She said that the problem is that most students say they don't have time to expose themselves to the language. I think the problem, and this is my contention, I think the problem is that we're exposing students to the kinds of content or to the kinds of things that are not related to their own intrinsic needs.
Yeah, wow, that's what I was going to say.
Oh, well, we're on the same.
No, I was just I would just say that I was going to get all philosophical, but you know, John Dewey would say that as a teacher, our job is to tap into the psychology of our learners and our students, and to find out what intrigues them, and that by focusing on what they're interested in, and we call this personalization now, but I think Dewey would take it further. He would say, well, we are not teaching, we are trying to give them the tools so that they can take what we teach them about English and explore what interests them in English. So we're creating this sense of inquiry, or what Freire might call, what is it at Leo? Not problem solving, but essentially,
problem-based learning.
Problem-based learning, right? Where we're giving them the tools to learn, and then the exposure is up to them. So we need to tap into their psychology, as Leo said, to find out what's intrinsically motivating for them.
Well, Roberta asked you, what would you recommend? This is why I find that with every learner, I don't like this idea of teaching general English, because I don't believe in general English. And Michael Long would say it's English for nebulous purposes, right? What we need to do is I think the starting point for everything would be the needs analysis. So you find out what your students are interested in, and then you teach English through that medium. So for example, I have a Japanese student that I teach online, and I've been working with her for over a year, and her context is mostly business. So all we do is we focus on texts based on business. We do business presentations. She only listens to business podcasts. And she also said she really likes extreme sports. So I gave her a podcast based on extreme sports. So a lot of it, so I think what I'm trying to say here, maybe it will make more sense if I organize my thoughts, is we shouldn't really be teaching general English. I think learning has to adapt to the student's lifestyle. So the learning connects to their lifestyle. What are your interests? Oh, I really love horror movies. Oh, there's a good podcast about horror movies. Why don't you just watch horror movies? Why don't you just read texts or read novels that are somewhat in that specific genre? when they listen to podcasts, they freak out. They do. All students do in the beginning. That's why we're releasing a podcast for learners, and we're going to be tapping into different areas. But I think students have to embrace the fear. And Michael Birch said something interesting. The language of a very specific area will anyway include general language. Absolutely. And this is why I don't think we should be teaching general English. I think we should be tapping into the learner's interests and teach English through that. So it's learning based on your lifestyle. I think if we're able to combine these two things, then I think we're on the right track. The problem, of course, is this. In a classroom with 12, 15, 20 learners, every student will have a different need. Every student will have a different interest. What do we do in a situation like this? Should we teach general English? No. What we should do is what we talked about in our session on Friday is we should give our students transferable skills, things that will help them cope with the podcasts, cope with the language when they are not in the classroom with us. Because we don't want our students to be dependent on us. The whole point is for them to become autonomous.
To join society.
I got too excited.
Yeah.
I got
no,
carried
that's
away.
okay. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Take over.
No, well, so all we want to do is really just take what Leo started and kind of relate it all back to the language classroom and second language acquisition theory. So Leo, let's just quickly review on the next slide is more just a review. So basically we can contrast implicit and explicit knowledge. That same contrast is connected to the way we would break down procedural and declarative knowledge. And basically there are this idea of two separate systems, and there are different takes on this. There's no right or wrong answer, but essentially there's the one camp which would say that we can convert this explicit declarative knowledge over time through practice into implicit and procedural or automaticity, versus the other camp which says no, they're actually two very different systems and they're not connected. And we'll talk about that. However, we're actually going to, Leo, on the next slide, we're going to look at the interface that Leo was talking about earlier. So here we have the interface of the strong interface. So this would be the declarative to procedural. So the first camp I was talking about, where through the introduction and explicit teaching, it becomes procedural, versus the opposite end, which is the no interface. So and really what we're talking about in terms of a classroom context is the role of teaching. Okay, so the strong interface would say that teaching plays a central role, versus the no interface, which would argue that teaching is maybe minimal or maybe completely unnecessary. So before I start talking a little bit about the no interface, I'd like to tell you a little story. So I work a lot with writing counselors in the library, university library where I work. And it's very interesting because almost all of them will come up to me. So I'm kind of like the EAL, or English as for additional language speakers, expert, even though I'm not, but I've assumed that role. And they'll often come up to me and they'll say, my student writers are asking me the rule between no ing or infinitive or gerund, and I don't know how to answer it because I don't know what they are. And and they tell me, like, because when they were learning the language, they were just learning it because they grew up in the language. And this is a little bit what Danilo and Sandra were talking about in terms of how they learned Portuguese growing up in Brazil, and Tamika and I, how we learned English growing up where we did in English-speaking countries. And I said, well, and I always tell them the same thing. I said, well, sit down and let me tell you a little bit about Krashen's, Leo.
Yes, let's get there.
Krashen's input hypothesis. So basically what they're saying is that when they were growing up, they weren't learning the language. They were acquiring it through their participation in meaningful interaction with their mothers, right? Or their fathers or their peers. And the no interface position would basically say that's in fact how we acquire languages, that languages are learned subconsciously, and that through this practice, meaning focused practice, that you acquire the language and become more proficient in it. And that learning is actually is actually the conscious thing that we do when we monitor what we are saying and when we check the grammar rules and correct ourselves. And that they would argue that that actually perhaps even slows down the overall communication process. So here we can acquire the language, and learning plays a role in what we produce, but we would not learn the language to acquire it. So you cannot learn explicit knowledge and then from that explicit knowledge produce this implicit or meaningful. You can't perform in the language, so to speak. And I think, Leo, we have a nice little quote on the next. Oh, sorry, you want to jump in?
I was just going to say one thing. I think that explains one of the biggest shortcomings of a presentation practice production paradigm, is that it assumes that everything that is taught
is acquired.
Everything that is learned throughout the lesson. So if I teach the simple present now, or the present, let's use the present perfect because that seems to be more pervasive. But if I teach the present perfect at the beginning of the lesson, I would expect my students to acquire that by the end. And as you said, Mike, be able to produce. And we often see that when we get to the production aspect of the lesson, students are not using the present perfect. They're still able to get away with communicating, right? They're still able to get by communicating in the language, but not using the target language that we expected them to use. And I think that's why a task-based approach would be more conducive to learning. But we're going to get to that. Anyway, Mike, there's a quote, right?
Yeah, there's just a simple quote. So basically, to summarize, that what we learned cannot be converted automatically into acquired or implicit knowledge.
Okay.
What Leo just said. And it's funny because Leo did mention the PPP approach, which is, yeah, I think there's next slide, Leo. Sorry about that. Yeah. So sorry, Leo's in control of the slide. So again, we have the no interface approach, which is basically how we learned our first language, which is kind of through this meaningful interaction with our peers, we acquired our knowledge of the language. We were able to acquire the language. We weren't actually learning rules and then from those rules producing the language. Versus the strong interface position, which of course here would mean that the teacher plays a guiding role and central role in this. And for those of you, yeah, Leo, the next slide. And for those of you that have been through TESOL courses, TEFL courses, TESOL, the diploma, CELTA, you've probably have been trained and oriented to teaching around this stance where we would introduce a language point, we practice that language point, and then we would have the students produce that. And the thought being that through our teaching over time, through our teaching and practice over time, the students will acquire the language and be able to perform in the language in a way that is automatized and without them having to think consciously about it. And we know that, well, in fact, I would argue that this is, as Leo's pointed out, that this is not always the case, that we can present language, we can practice it, but oftentimes it's quite challenging for our learners to produce that language spontaneously without that sort of guided prompt or display question, like, did you play rugby on the weekend? Yes, I did. No, I didn't. And that's why this approach is sometimes called by Leo and not the present, practice, and produce, but rather the present, practice, pray that they use it.
Actually, quickly, Mike, a short anecdote on this. My partner was learning Portuguese online, and she was taking classes online, and this was about 5 years ago. And I'll never forget this lesson. The teacher prepared wonderful slides, and it was a lesson on introducing yourself in Portuguese, right? So it's like, hello, hola, meu nome é blah, blah, blah. I'm from, eu sou de, parará, whatever. You guys know what I mean. Anyway, so they did a lot of he was presenting and drilling, and there was a lot of gap fill. And then he showed her a bunch of pictures with famous celebrities. That's a bit of a, anyway, so there's a bunch of celebrities there. And then he asked her, okay, now I want you to introduce these celebrities to me. And she just looked at him and she said, I don't know how to do this. So I think that was the day when I said, that's it. PPP doesn't really work, because it was a 45-minute lesson where you said, Mike, is presenting the language, they're practicing, and then we automatically, I think this is the assumption, or the wrong assumption that we have, is that students are going to be able to process and then proceduralize, automatize, and then produce. Everyone, that's too much for a language learner to be able to do in 45 minutes. Regardless of how fast your brain works, students are not going to be able to do that. Anyway, moving on.
Yep. And then, so we've talked a little bit about, again, we're thinking about this in terms of the classroom. So the no interface was, again, that seeing as teaching and learning as taking a minimal role that we actually acquire by participating in the language, we learn by doing, versus the strong interface, which again is puts teachers at a central role, where the teacher is providing the input, as Leo said, practicing the input, and then the students are expected to then produce this input, and then over time, through this regular practice, they would then produce it more spontaneously. And now we're in the middle, and again, Ellis would say that this does not fall in the middle. This is a continuum. So there might be times where this goes closer to the teacher taking a larger role, versus it goes closer to the teacher having a more minimal role. But basically, we can kind of think of this as the space or linchpin that kind of operates in between the strong and the weak, the strong and the no interface. And basically, he would argue that explicit knowledge is not just directly transformed into implicit knowledge, but it facilitates this process. And this is where we would we would move away from teaching a language and versus helping the students notice language, or what you might hear called language emergence, where we're working with a meaningful task or a meaning focused task, like a conversation, maybe not a conversation, but some sort of task where they're working in the language. And then from that, we notice that there's a gap. So in order to complete the task, they need more knowledge or more assistance or guidance. So when we would help them sort of notice the gap and then teach to that gap. So for example, Leo, do you want to work through the third person example?
I was just going to say, I think Ellis's idea of this weak interface model is that certain aspects of the language, such as in this case, the third person S is a good example of this. For him, it can be converted into implicit knowledge only if the learner is at that correct developmental stage.
Level,
yeah. So a lot of the times, what we might be teaching the present perfect, but the student is not at the right developmental stage to actually process and use the present perfect in that sense. So this is why third person S is one of the first things we teach when we're teaching language, but it's by far one of the last things students actually acquire. So as somebody said here in the chat, teaching doesn't imply learning. And that's it. I think the goal of teaching is to facilitate learning, is to provide students with the tools to actually be able to acquire the language on their own. Because languages, and I'm going to say this, and you can quote me on that, but I think languages were not meant to be taught. Languages were meant to be learned. So moving on here, Mike.
Yeah, and I'll just read through this quote. So explicit knowledge of grammatical structures makes it more likely that learners will attend to the structure in the input and carry out the cognitive comparison between what they observe in the input and their own output. And basically what we're trying to do here is to make the implicit explicit and to make the explicit automatic. So by the first point, I mean by making the implicit explicit, we're basically trying to help them realize, help them notice that there are rules and that these rules are often predictable. And that by looking at why they're saying stuff, so when by giving them the ability to notice these rules, it can help them produce an unlimited amount of structures using those same rules in the future. And then similar with the explicit to automatic is that once these rules are known, they can then be acquired and then used automatically. Leo?
Mm-hmm. No, it's just a comment by Michael Birch here. Or will they make a structural comparison as opposed to a cognitive comparison? Right? That's an interesting point.
Interesting point.
Especially because the structure is regular. The structure is often predictable, right? But once a rule has been acquired, it can be applied almost without conscious thought because it has been internalized. And I think that's what makes learners more fluent, more able, and more natural. Yeah, especially when the structure is more salient than the meaning. I agree with you, Mike. Michael.
Yeah, and it's like you said, Leo. It's all about internalizing it so that it's no longer. They don't have to go back and retrieve that. But that's fair. That's a fair point. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, Michael's on it.
Yeah.
But that's it. It's about noticing the gap and then giving them strategy, recognizing what's happening in that gap, and then they can reapply those rules again and again. Not necessarily teaching the rules, but working backwards.
Yes.
From the language.
Let's move on. And how does, Mike, go ahead. This is still you.
Yeah. So, I mean, well, so how does this all apply? So we've talked about a lot of terms here, but focus on meaning. So Danilo, you were talking a little bit about communicative language teaching. So that would be an example of focus on meaning and focusing on interaction and even functions. Focus on forms. That would be the actual teaching of language forms. Again, just to reiterate what Leo said, I don't think that we would necessarily set out to teach forms, i.e. this week we're going to teach the simple present, next week we're going to teach the simple past, because we don't believe that there is this kind of sequence of grammar. Whereas we would perhaps focus on form. So once again, start off with a task that is meaning focused, and then when the learners are struggling to say, complete the task because there is that language gap, then we would provide the input and the feedback necessary and then have them do that task again. And that is, of course, focus on form. So the individual form that is coming up that they need to complete that meaningful task. And again, PPP, getting away from the teacher-centered role and maybe focusing more on TDLT or task-based language teaching. And as you'll see, these other models, which are more towards the no frequency. So that's basically what it looks like. So basically, we have our no interface, which is basically looking at Krashen and the emergent syllabus, procedural syllabus, focus on meaning, maybe even communicative language teaching. And then the other pole would be the strong, which is, again, the PPP approach, audiolingual method, grammar translations. But on the next slide, Leo, I think we would recommend and subscribe to the weak interface, which basically, again, looks at declarative knowledge facilitating this procedural. So focusing on meaning first, and then helping learners by filling in that the gap.
Right. Yeah. I think this is important. One of the things, what Mike has said right now is most textbooks subscribe to a strong interface.
That is a very observant point. Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
That's where textbooks are. Textbooks sit here. And I think it was a comment by someone saying, I don't remember who said this in the chat, but somebody said that, textbooks are easier for teachers to use. I agree. But I would argue that textbooks de-skill teachers. They make you a bad teacher because the moment you just rely on a textbook over and over again, it's kind of like you're an autopilot. You're not really teaching the learners. So I'm not saying that textbooks are bad. I'm just saying that textbooks de-skill the teacher. I think if you want to become a better teacher, I think my suggestion would be to move away from textbooks, and they can be a guide. Yes, they can be a guide. I agree. As long as we use the tasks from the textbook, I think we can taskify the course book, right? Instead of starting with the presentation of language, we would look at the production activities and then maybe front the production activities and start the lesson with the production as opposed to the presentation.
Yeah, and I think it's maybe a topic for a debate for another day. But I remember your podcast episode with Neil McCutcheon, Leo. You talked a little bit. The problem with most of these textbooks is that they're not specific to the learners, and therefore even the tasks themselves might not be applicable to the real world context or the exposure or the environment that these people need to use English in order to cope, right? So again, that's a debate for another day, but that's a keen observation by Mike that most do follow that strong interface.
I like
good comment here. Yeah, Yela says that teachers should not be slaves to the textbook; they should be the masters. I like how you phrase that.
Yes. Lorenzo said we should learn how to exploit the material from the course book. I agree, but the problem is when we're just teaching from a textbook, then we don't really learn how to think or critically analyze the activities from the textbook. Basic students have no vocab to produce firstly. What do you recommend? I would recommend very simple tasks.
Related to some reading, authentic materials.
Yeah.
Perceptive tasks too, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting because it goes back to, for me, it speaks to a larger debate. And we talked about this is because I think Sandra brought it up initially that exposure is a key point. And as Leo, you touched on, the only way to kind of instill this sense of inquiry or student-based inquiry is to tap into their psychology. And textbooks do not allow us to do that. Textbooks almost act as a divider, as a filter, which separate the students' needs from us, their sympathetic interlocutor, if you will, right? They're the sympathetic ear that they need so they can practice and improve. And I just think that while textbooks serve a purpose, that if we really want to instill the intrinsic motivation for our students to go out and learn and to seek opportunities to learn, then we have to move beyond the textbook.
More comments here. I think textbooks can be good for students to refer to and review independently at home, but in the class, more spontaneous and real-world tasks give rise to more. I agree with Ihe. Yeah, absolutely. Michael said descriptive grammars underlying PPP are also inadequate. I agree. I would find that a lot of the grammar, especially the pedagogical grammar that our learners are being exposed to, also simplifies the language a little bit too much, I would argue.
Yeah, and I would argue even with the systemic, like functional linguistics and some discourse analysis, I think yes, there are ways in which knowing what an introduction contains or what an essay looks like and what those components are. And I'm a big proponent of discourse analysis, but all it takes is for universities and professors to change the way they assess, and then all of a sudden, again, they're left with an inability to make decisions for themselves. And I think it just goes back to what we said earlier. It's finding patterns is great, and that's what we should focus on. But I think it's only if it gives them the flexibility that they can reuse as often as possible. We talked a lot about writing 5-paragraph essays and things like that. And then I just got a WeChat message from one of my students. They were saying, "Oh, we have to write a three-story thesis essay." I was like, "Oh my gosh!" So all this work we do with them, and again, I'm a proponent of discourse analysis, but there are so many genres out there, and at the end of the day, it basically. So it's up to me then to teach them how to look for those patterns in say models of 3-story theses.
All right.
We're getting really off topic, but sorry.
So let's look at what language awareness is. So there are 2 cartoons here, and perhaps we could consider what they're trying to say about how language are learned or how languages are perceived in the mind. For the first one here, and are you the new English teacher? We're looking at a definition of language awareness. So perhaps people can type in their definitions of what is language awareness. What does that mean to be aware of language? I'm going to refer to the American Association of Language Awareness. Their definition is very simple. It's explicit knowledge. So we're going back to the idea of procedural, declarative knowledge, in this case, explicit knowledge about language, and a conscious perception and sensitivity in language learning, language teaching, and more importantly, language use. I know a lot of people that have actually learned a language explicitly, and they're still able to communicate, they're still able to be fluent. But those people eventually become teachers. I would argue, especially most people that I know that have learned a language that way, they eventually end up becoming teachers. I could be wrong, but a lot of them are very good at learning rules, and then they eventually become teachers. I know students, especially my Korean students, are very good at learning rules. They're able to recite a lot of those rules, but I think you probably know that Koreans are not very fluent because they have all these rules in their minds, and they're not able to verbalize or to communicate fluently in this specific case. So what we're going to do now, yes, exploring the benefits that can be derived from developing a good knowledge about language. This is going to be another definition of language awareness, and of course developing a conscious understanding of the intricacies of the language, and of course noticing how people learn the language or those rules and use them. So this is a question that I wanted to ask. How many of you are constantly paying attention to how people use language, are constantly paying attention to new expressions, to nuances of the language? Let's see. The rules serve as analytical tool. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to get into McCarthy. Actually, not McCarthy, Carter, Ronald Carter, who talks about his own definition of language awareness, which reflects the different concerns in language awareness. So let's look at that very quickly. For him, language awareness involves at least 4 things. The first one, awareness of some of the properties of language: creativity, playfulness, double meanings. Okay? The second one, awareness of the embedding of language within culture. So there's a little bit of cultural knowledge here. Learning to read the language is learning about the cultural properties of that specific language. Idiomatic language, metaphorical language in particular, tells a lot about culture. English, for example, very metaphorical in the sense that we say, for example, that people are liquid. And an example of that would be when we say a stream of, or we say the crowd had flooded onto the stadium. So we kind of treat language metaphorically in that sense. So that kind of knowledge is also language awareness. The third one would be self-consciousness about the forms of the language we use. And this is relating back to what Michael said, analytic tools. So we can use language to analyze language, and recognizing the relationships between these forms and the meanings of a language are sometimes arbitrary. And one example of this would be prepositions: different from, different than, right? Depending on the kind of your background. I've heard some British people saying different from, different than. And of course, the last one, awareness of the close relationship between language and ideology. Seeing through language, in other words. I would actually argue that A and D are very appropriate to language awareness of native speakers. Native speakers probably possess very high awareness of the properties of language and creativity and playfulness, and relationships between language and ideology, right?
And probably awareness and embedding of the language within culture too, Leo, because they would have that cultural capital of growing
I was
up.
going to say that B and C to me are more relevant to a second language acquisition context, in a sense. And C, I don't know if people are going to agree with me, is the cornerstone of curricula in language to education. Even though we have a lot of disagreements about the role of explicit knowledge of grammar, a focus on the forms of language, and a relationship between form and meaning. And all of this seems to be rather uncontroversial. So let's move on. Your language awareness. different than other parts of the world. Oh, different than is becoming much more current in the UK. I would do some corporate research just to find out more about that, because I have, yeah, different from, different than, yeah, maybe frequency. So we're gonna get to a task now. Oh, Michael is he's multitasking. He's already checked it. So you can go to your handout to do a very quick self-evaluation of your own language awareness. And you have to be honest. You have to be honest. I would bring back here Herring Frankfurt's notion of the difference between lying and bullshitting. We're very good. We're not, lying is when you know the truth. Bullshitting is when you have absolutely no knowledge of the truth. So you probably all know. So Andrew just copied the handout into the chat. So if you can click on the link, it will take you to a handout that looks more or less like this. I'm going to try to open it here too. Oops. Okay, let's go here. So this is what the handout looks like.
And I think, folks, you know, we put this together a while ago, and this was actually our own kind of inventory. So as you go through it, even if you know, it's nice as just like a self-diagnostic to think like, wow, like, yeah, how much do I know about each one of these? Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's kind of cool. And if there are any others that you'd want to throw up there, just throw them in the chat. Because I would put genre analysis in here too, but that's just because that's my jam.
Okay.
Honesty is important. Just be honest.
Yeah, so we have things like aspect. So you just have to basically number from one being what? Ooh. Okay, so one meaning
No idea.
You have no idea. And 5 is like, I know this like the back of my hand. Nothing new here. So this is just something for you to go through on your own, being honest as much as you can.
Just take notes on your own or in the chat. Maybe you won't be able to type into the document itself, but
yeah, I know this. Oh, so Michael said awareness or ability to explain. Good question. If you know something like the back of your hand, then you have the awareness and you have the ability to explain. If you have a somewhat vague idea, I think you would give a but answer in class. Right?
Yeah, but kind of,
yeah. Well, that could be true.
It's a well answer. Well,
it sounds right, but I'm not sure.
I don't know how many native speakers of a language, of English in this case, know what a determiner is. Right? I mean, even, yeah, I don't think a lot of people know. I mean, if you teach, you probably know what a determiner is. Oh, that's a good book. So Mike is holding a copy of, I think everyone knows this book.
Oh, sorry, folks. I'm sure everyone, if you've done your diploma or maybe even the TESOL, I don't know if it's required reading for the TESOL now, but
yeah.
Martin Parrott, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I mean, we have things here such as will versus be going to, reported speech, voice, tense. The difference between tense and aspect is something that also people don't seem to be very aware of. Anyway, I'm going to go back here while people are still working through that. I think the question would be, are you comfortable with everything on that list? Are you comfortable explaining all of those things?
I guess the thing that came to my mind is we were talking about design and analyzing language. Mm-hmm. But to analyze language, we would need to be aware of those aspects, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's why I think the best designers are the ones that do that, right? They're able to look at a text and analyze it, identify dissect it. Yeah, they can see what's at play.
I think that's the best way to explain what language awareness is your ability to not only notice language but also to look at a text and dissect it. Yeah.
And then the next part, I guess, would be then taking what's in there and then relating it back to your learners based on their need, right? That's the
Mm-hmm.
full circle, maybe.
Yeah.
But even maybe, I don't know, do you want people to put like a percentage up? Because I think it's an overwhelming list,
It is.
to be honest. So
that's why it's a 5-hour workshop webinar. Yeah. You have to go through all of them individually. No, we don't have to. We can keep that as a reference for later on. And if you have problems with any of these, let's say how many, let's say, Mike, I think you're right. A percentage would be good. I would say, I don't know, what's your percentage, Mike? Or Andrew, what would you say?
Let me look at the list again.
10%? 30?
10%. No, I gotta be higher than that. I think Mike asked a good question. You know, explaining it is one thing, because I think I understand and I can recognize a lot of them, but I'm just looking at pre and post modification of nouns because I'm doing this a lot with my IELTS students. And as a teacher, I still struggle to again kind of point out the rules involved in each one of them, right? And how they work and how to teach them in a way that's engaging, right?
Yeah, I think that's the other question is you might have the awareness, but can you actually teach it in a way that will help your students? Well,
that's what I was going to say, the same thing.
But that goes back to the Swan quote, right?
Yeah.
I would say my percentage is increasing, and what I'm able to incorporate into my classrooms is also increasing. So I'm taking what we're getting at here and being aware of what I'm already aware of and what maybe I need to increase, and every day, you know, trying to incorporate a little bit more.
Okay. All right, let's move on. We're gonna have another task here. So language awareness for teachers. I'm gonna ask everyone to just vote on this. So we're gonna start with the first one here. Number 1, strong language awareness is not required, handy, or vital for teachers. You can just type your responses to this one. Ooh, I think we're getting, oof. Okay. I'm just gonna circle what I'm seeing here in the chat.
No hedging, Michael. No hedging. Come on now.
I'm gonna say you can't hedge that. No, nearly.
No,
commit.
It's vital. Okay, so we're all in agreement. All right, let's go to the number 2 here. Now, justify your answer. If you think it's not required for teachers, explain why, but nobody said that. If you consider it to be handy or vital, I think the question is, in what ways does it help teachers teach? Oh, Michael decided that he's gonna say not vital. Okay. Shauna said learning a language is learning culture. That's one of the aspects that Carter mentioned. It's one of them. There are 4. Yes. But yeah, so I think the question is, if you consider it to be handy or vital in this case, how, in what ways does it help teachers teach the language? How can I teach something that I'm not aware of? Yeah. We're not gonna get to the answers yet. It informs our instruction and the students' learning. Yeah. Okay. Let's go to question number 3 here. In what ways can language awareness not help teachers? I think that's, now let's think about the opposite bias here. Like how would language awareness not help us teachers? English language is a difficult language to follow. Yeah. Vanilla said it helps the teachers to foresee students' difficulties. Yeah. I want to ask a question about that. Do you, when you're teaching, do you always preemptively think about the kinds of difficulties that students are going to have? Or is that something that you deal with as the problems arise in the classroom? It's a good question for everyone there. If we focus too much on rules and prescriptive grammar, we try to anticipate difficulties. Yes. Okay. Yeah, I was thinking about that. Huh. do we anticipate the problems that students are going to, I mean, this is what we were taught. If you took the Delta, the CELTA, the TESOL course, all these courses that we take, that's what you were taught to do, try to anticipate and come up with a possible solution to them. Yes.
I think that's a good point. I think as a person who likes to use task-based approaches,
you can't really.
I would argue that no, you can't, but, and this goes back a little bit to your collocations, you can think about what would naturally emerge in authentic, right, interaction, or if people were authentically, genuinely working on this task, look for that language, if it will help fill that gap, right? I think it goes back to what Kelly said. You can't, like, you don't know what's missing if you don't know it, right?
Yeah.
And then in terms of prioritizing, I think it goes back to what you said, Leo, or what Long says about needs analysis, right? Here's what the task is. Here's what I would expect them to need to know, which is a little subjective. Yeah. but again, it's like, what would if it's done in an authentic way, then what would naturally emerge would be something that is this, and what is if what is being produced doesn't match that, then as a teacher who's trying to help that student enter that community, I would need to fill that gap.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's prescribed.
And here's another question. Question number 4. I mean, the chat is blowing up. Some people believe that a high level of language awareness might actually interfere. Can you think of any ways in which this might be the case? A student who is, a teacher who is very keen on language. It's what we call a grammar guru. And he has this, or he or she has developed this very high level of language awareness. How can this interfere in the classroom? I've seen cases where this is a problem. I can think of one now. I remember observing a teacher who was very keen on grammar. Maybe she could become too focused on accuracy rather than communication. Yes. Stifle student learning. Yes. Teachers lecturing. I think one of the ways in which this can actually interfere in the classroom is a teacher lecturing on the present perfect for 30 minutes. Andrew, we talked about this, that one person who taught all the uses of the present perfect in 1 week.
Oh yeah, crash course, present perfect.
Present perfect crash course. Students learned everything about the present perfect. They talked about the present perfect, and they didn't talk in the present perfect. And I would even argue that the present perfect is what we call it's a conversation opener. We never actually use the present perfect when we're having
what's it called? Table setting.
You say, hey, have you ever been to Japan? Oh yeah, well, I was there last year. Oh yeah, who did you go with? So it's kind of like we start with the present perfect, and everything else is in the simple past or even simple present, but we can't really assume that. Temeka said, humility is too important. Students come to learn the language, not to praise the teacher. Yes. Some teachers love the sound of their own voice. This is why they lecture for hours. Language changes, so sometimes awareness may not reflect how the language is currently being used. Yes.
I was just going to say, Leo, how long is this presentation again? No, just joking.
We're almost there. We're going to move on.
We're trying not to lecture. We want to make this. No, that's the last thing we want to do. That's the last thing.
Yeah. So let's move on. Rod.
Luckily, I hate the sound of my own voice, so that's good.
Yeah. Ryan and Bolito said that this is one of the things that they said is that the more aware a teacher is of language and how it actually works, right? What makes the micro tick, the better. And this language awareness has a lot of relevance to a focus on forms, focus on form, and focus on meaning. And again, going back to focus on forms here, is this idea of teaching discrete points of language. This is what Scott Thornbury coined the term grammar McNuggets, where we teach the simple present, and then we teach the present continuous, and then we teach the present perfect or whatever. We teach these grammar McNuggets in linear fashion, and we expect students to be able to put together all these grammatical points, or this is what we call the synthetic syllabus. They're able to synthesize all this language and then put it all together in a conversation. So this is why we learn your English. We don't subscribe to a strong interface. For us, is people learn by doing, very much like learning how to ride a bicycle. We don't teach the bicycle parts. We don't practice vocab with the bicycle parts. We don't do gap fill with the bicycle parts. We expect them to just, here, try to ride the bicycle. And then from there, we kind of like scaffold learning. And focus on form, and Michael already talked about this, is this idea of drawing students' attention to language items as they naturally emerge in the lessons. And again, the focus is primarily on meaning, on communication. So it's learning by doing, talking in the language. And as communication is somewhat breaking down, or students are having problems to communicate or producing certain structures, that's when we kind of chime in and help them. What else? Moving on here, to focus on meaning, it's what we call this non-interventionist approach, which we basically abandon a focus on forms and replicate a lot of what we do in our first language. So focus on form also poses a challenge to teachers' language awareness. Why? Because we have two forms of task-based language teaching. We have a very strong task-based language teaching where the task is the basic unit of teaching and the acquisition of form takes care of itself. There's very little intervention from the teacher. The teacher is just kind of nudging students here and there. And of course, we have what we call a task-based language teaching that is a weak form where task is at the core, but there is focused instruction, perhaps instruction before the task and instruction following the task. And of course, focus on meaning is the least obvious. The emphasis is non-intervention. Students are just communicating. Which brings us to Thornbury, who basically has a list of potential weaknesses for teachers' language awareness. If you don't possess a high degree of language awareness, there might be what a lot of you said in the chat, anticipating learners' problems and an inability to plan lessons that are pitched at the right level. So you won't know if this is going to be too easy or too difficult for your students. The second one, and this to me is the most important because it's this lack of ability to critically analyze the textbook and adapt. This is the important thing. I think textbooks can be adaptable to the specific needs of learners. So what I find is when teachers don't have a very high level of language awareness, they basically take everything at face value. As I don't remember who said this, but they become slaves to the textbook and they just basically follow the textbook slavishly. Whereas the textbook is more almost like a springboard for discussion. And then the teaching actually happens without the textbook. Also, and this is another very important point, when you don't have a high degree of language awareness, is you're not able to actually address those mistakes. Going back to task-based language teaching, a lot of task-based language teaching, the strong interface for task-based language teaching basically means what we're doing as teachers is we're just focusing on the language that is naturally emerging from the students, and we're scaffolding and reformulating, reconstructing things that they're saying, but again, letting the communication flow. And the last thing he says is, and this is related to my preamble, is this idea of gaining the confidence of your students. Because if you don't know how to explain certain things, or if you just, it's the explanation that I've seen teachers giving in the past is like, but teacher, why do we use this? Just because. And I don't think that's something that our students want to know. Or because it sounds right. That's something that we see a lot. It's the sound, the emergence of the sound right principle. Oh, it's because it sounds right. Okay, but that's not enough. That's not, our learners want to know more than that. So Roberto said, students need to trust us and know the reason that they're learning that. Yes, I think this is important. Students need to know why they're learning something. Let's move on here. What else do we have? Language awareness for students. So let's get to that. And then we can take a 2-minute break before we come back for the next 2 hours. I'm joking, but let's move on. So for students, strong language awareness is not required, handy, or vital. What do you guys think? Handy, okay. Michael said vital to become teachers later. Yes. Yeah, I think everyone is saying handy. That seems to be the agreement. Not required, I think it's, I mean, we need a little bit of it. Now I want you to justify your answer. Why? Why is it handy?
Is it hedging if everyone just chooses the middle? Like, come on.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe I should change the order next time. Yeah, why is it handy? Michael already answered. It's vital if you want to become a teacher.
Okay.
Ah, inductive reasoning. Rule making from examples. Good. So they can correct themselves. I wonder how much our students are actually able to correct themselves, because remember when we do a lot of peer correction in writing, they were never able to correct those mistakes. That basically means they didn't have enough or a higher degree of language awareness. I think a question that I want to ask everyone, which is not here, I didn't put this in the slides, but where would you start with language awareness? What would be the first thing you would teach your students in terms of language awareness? Would you teach the verb tense or the verb system, I should say? Where would you start with language awareness? What would be the first thing you would teach your students in terms of language awareness? Sharon gave a good answer. She says, I have no idea. That's a good answer. Sandra said Lexis. Okay. I have my own answer. Maybe verb, because it's the main part of the sentence. Lorenzo, I would disagree with you on that, buddy. I would say, I mean, depending on the context, especially if we're talking about academic English, I would say the noun phrase is more important than the verb phrase. Chunks, functions, okay. Okay. Collocations. It's still going back to Lexis here. Okay.
Nobody said past perfect, so that's good.
That's good. Yeah. Pragmatics. Okay. Alphabet. The alphabet. Okay. Nouns. Yeah. We're getting to. How about starting with the foundation? In this case, would be parts of speech. I think if our learners understand parts of speech, then I think they will have a very good foundation upon which they can actually develop better language awareness. And what we do, what we believe in, is we subscribe to an approach where we start with language awareness, especially awareness of the parts of speech. If a student knows in this case that a sentence is basically not subject, verb, object, but noun, phrase plus verb, and I'm going to actually type this up here. Noun phrase plus verb. And then you might say, but Leo, what comes after the verb? Well, it really depends on the verb, because the verb is the trigger. The verb triggers everything that comes next. But for us, I think we should start with parts of speech. Again, looking at the open group, or what we call content words, nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. And then looking at function words, which would be conjunctions, prepositions, determiners, right, and pronouns. And I find that once students understand these two different groups, they're able to understand the relationships between them, especially when you think about adjectives. Adjectives are always used with nouns. Adjectives are always, there's always a preposition after a noun. If there's a preposition after a noun, there's always going to be a noun, right? Are you determined to learn all of that? Oh, that's Michael. That's a different. I thought it was.
That was my poor attempt at a pun, right? You mentioned determiners, and I asked you if you were determined to learn and to teach.
But they don't have to learn them. They don't have to have like, perhaps.
Or are you determined to learn those points?
That was a good. I got
I was
it.
going to say, you don't have a determiner in that.
There, I just added.
Yeah. Sharon
Hopefully
says, I
that
need
was
resources. Sharon, we're designing a course for learners. We're calling it the Fundamentals of Language Learning, where students start with parts of speech. They move on to learn vocab. But again, they cannot learn vocabulary if they don't understand parts of speech, because then they won't be able to change the part of speech of a word. They might know the noun, but they might not know the verb form. But in order for you to learn the verb form, what kind of language knowledge do you need to have? You need to know affixes, right? You need to know prefixes, suffixes. I mean, they're all connected. So for us, parts of speech would be the first step. What verb tense would be used to teach parts of speech? What verb tense to teach parts of speech? I'm not sure I understand that question. Teach the doing questions. They just think it's weird. Yeah, we should do a workshop, a webinar on that. All of them? Yeah, basically. I focus more on the noun phrase, like focus more on nouns, because nouns are more important, because pretty much every word connects to a noun. Determiners come before nouns. Adjectives come before nouns. Nouns are connected to other nouns using prepositions, noun of noun. Nouns are also connected to verbs, right? The structure of a sentence is always noun phrase plus verb. So yeah, the only word that doesn't really connect with nouns are adverbs, but who cares about adverbs? Stephen King says we don't even need adverbs in English. I'm not saying they're not important. You're bound to need the question.
He's absolutely wrong. But,
yeah. Okay. So to go back to learners, I think I'm going to move on here because we're running out of time. People want to enjoy the rest of their Sunday. Tomorrow, everybody's back to work. Not really, because we have to stay on lockdown. Well, staying home tomorrow. We'll have another webinar. Maybe we can just keep going here for the next couple of hours. But and this is a pyramid by Dave Willis, who was one of the proponents of task-based language teaching. And he talks about the essential conditions for students to learn a language. And you might think, okay, Leo, students need motivation. Yes, we need motivation or discipline, whatever you want to call it, to learn the language, to do the work, to listen, to read, to write, to speak. It's discipline. If students are not motivated, they're not going to learn. The second one, and everybody talked about this, exposure. We need to be exposed to the language. It has to be rich exposure. It has to be exposure to language which is authentic, not textbook language, and to a certain extent, comprehensible. And that's the only thing I would say I kind of agree with Krashen on this, is that it has to be slightly above their current level. If it's too easy, there's no challenge. If it's too difficult, some people said that, oh, my students don't want to listen. I find that students just give up very easily, because the moment something is a little bit difficult, they say, I can't do it. But it's not because they can't do it. It's because they just haven't done it often enough. And I think as teachers, our job, our duty is to actually tap into their mindset and try to help them adopt a mentality or a mindset where difficulty only at the beginning. Everything is very hard when you do it the first time. But if you listen to something over and over and over again, I would argue that after the second or the third time you've done the same thing, it becomes easier. And of course, the last one, use. We have to use the language. So we have to be motivated to learn the language. We have to be exposed to learn the language, and we have to use the language. We have to create opportunities in the classroom where students can actually have meaningful interactions with each other, where they are talking in the language. And I'm going to re-emphasize this. They have to be talking in the language, not talking about the language. Now, a question for all of you. Where is teaching here? Is teaching an essential condition? We're all going to be without a job tomorrow after this webinar. Danilo said no. But Danilo, you teach, man. It's a facilitator. Yes. I'll have to find another
Not
job.
anymore.
Yes, teaching. I mean, how many people have learned languages without teachers?
Maybe most people.
Right? Many people learn languages with teachers or without teachers. And one of the things that the research has shown is that they have these three conditions. They have these three conditions. They're all highly motivated people. They were highly exposed to rich, authentic, comprehensible language, and they found opportunities for them to interact using that language. Andrew is a very good example of this. He learned Spanish from a completely weak interface position from home. Andrew, you want to tell us quickly if those three things were part of your learning experience?
Yeah, totally. Well, as you said, I learned Spanish in the environment. So I lived in Costa Rica for 4 years. When I moved there, I knew two very important words, hola and cerveza. Those are the two words that I knew. And I added some function words around that to politely order them, but I was quite rude in my first few days. But no, I quickly realized after like 3 days that I needed to learn it, and I just asked a bunch of questions to everyone that I knew, and then they got annoyed, and then I asked other people, and then I annoyed them, and just asked and started using it, and it took me a year to get a foundation of what we're talking about. And then after 1 year, I would say it really started to scale up. But I was incredibly motivated because I couldn't do anything. I couldn't eat. I couldn't order food. I had tons of opportunities for use, so that was like a big advantage for me. And obviously exposure to the language as well. But someone told me at the very beginning, she said, Andrew, one day it's just going to click for you. And I didn't believe her. I said, that's not true. But she was right. One day it clicked, and all of a sudden I wasn't thinking, it became automatic, and I wasn't thinking about the rules anymore, and I was just talking to people. It was pretty cool.
Lorenzo said something interesting. He said, I agree with Andrew. I learned Russian through friends, and I'm much more fluent in Russian than in French, and he went to school for 5 years.
But I'll say this, I'm fluent in my social interactions, but if you ask me like academic Spanish, forget it. I do have lots of grammatical errors. Instruction would have helped me immensely.
I think, yeah.
It goes back to like, what do we mean by learn a language, right? That's a deeper conversation, but I can function in Spanish. I can converse all my social interactions, texting, great. I used to work in Spanish as well. I probably couldn't anymore. It slipped a bit, but academic-wise, forget it. No.
A comment here by Sharon: immersion is the best teacher. I agree, but what about the students who cannot immerse themselves in the language, who cannot travel abroad? What can we do? Well, we can create an environment where they are actually immersed in the language. And the example I'm going to give you is of one of my mentees, one of the students that I've been working with for the past 3 years. He was very interested in philosophy and very much interested in history. So all I did was I said, here is a list of podcasts in philosophy and history. And he basically devoured that. And he said to me, now, he said, Leo, I can talk about philosophical topics in English, but I can't do that in Spanish. So in that sense, English became his first language to talk about philosophy, to talk about history. But of course, there are certain things that you are better able to do in Spanish, in this case, in Spanish. Andrew, did you speak French already? No, I don't think so.
No, I was just typing that. Unfortunately, no, I wish I spoke French. That would be cool. We should in Canada, but I don't know.
Yeah. So everyone is saying immersion is the best environment. Yeah, go Mike.
No, I was just going to say what you just said, Leo, I think goes back to, for me, this goes back to educational philosophy and motivation. And that right there is a great example of the teacher tapping into the psychology of the student, recognizing what motivates that student, and finding a way to find exposure based on that knowledge. And again, I keep saying the word inquiry, but it's curiosity, right? right? They're curious about this, and they see English as a tool to explore that curiosity.
Yeah.
And that's it. So exposure, as you said, could be online. It could be, you know, typically nowadays it is online, and probably will be for the next several months.
Or year.
But yeah, like I think the podcasts are a great one, and of course we're all a fan of podcasts here.
Ilhe said, I try to encourage my students in Canada by telling them that the classroom is outside. I think the classroom is really outside. If we think about the classroom, within the boundaries of a classroom, the classroom is a very artificial place for people to be learning a language. And this is what I like. I don't remember who said this, but one of these philosophers said that the difference between schooling and life is that life is much better, because schooling, you are taught a lesson and then you are tested on that. Whereas in life gives you the test and then teaches you the lesson. So if you go and you have a conversation with people, you kind of notice your own short. It's like, oh man, I'm not able to express my feelings very well in English, so I need to study that more. So I think by engaging in these meaningful interactions, I think students are going to become more aware of their own shortcomings. Anyway, so teaching, instruction is not an essential condition in this case. So if it's not an essential condition, what is it then? Well, let's get to the next slide. Instruction is desired. I think that's the word. Instruction would be desired. And the benefits of language awareness for students, first one, language acceleration, I should say. It might speed up a learner's natural language development in the sense. The second one being their output production. As a lot of you have said in the chat, it allows learners to notice and correct errors in their own output, especially during production activities, right? But this will happen until the production of the correct form becomes automatic. So they will still be making the same mistakes over and over and over again until that becomes automatic. The third one being the priming effect. Language awareness provides learners with explicit knowledge of the language, as we said throughout this webinar, which in turn allows them to notice the language, to generate and acquire rules and patterns in that specific target language. And I think the last one, if you're familiar with Thornbury's fossilization diaries, he basically talked about his experience relearning Spanish. And it's true, I think language awareness also may prevent fossilization. In other words, when an error becomes a permanent feature of a learner's interlanguage. For example, people who say, did you went, 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 and they're never, even if you teach them it's did you go, did you go, did you go, they're never able to fix that. And again, one of the hypotheses is that this comes from a lack of negative feedback on students' errors and a lack of push. And I think that's a good word. It comes from Meryl Swain, pushed output. This idea that a lack of push to make learners' output more accurate, which also relates to the output production. And this is why creating activities or designing tasks where students are forced, I like this word, forced to produce, because it is only through production that we can find what kinds of problems that they have. And then you can, and then, yes, Renata, thanks for finishing my sentence. Then you teach grammar. Then you teach grammar. You don't teach grammar before they use the language. You force them. No, it's okay. It's okay about the capital letter. She basically yelled at me. But that's good. That's okay. So finally, one could argue that language
She's
awareness.
Excited.
Yeah, she's excited. So was I. We can argue that language awareness facilitates the development, and this is why I think Lorenzo said this, the development of learner autonomy by equipping learners with language terminology, right? So which they will need when they're doing research on the language. We're proponents of using corporate tools. We expect our students to actually go to corporate and use those tools to actually help them with the language. However, there are some limitations in terms of language awareness. We talked about the benefits. So what are the limitations? I think the first limitation, is what we call the overuse effect. Many teachers will be familiar with this because it relates to learners thinking too much about the rules. obsessing with producing language that is accurate at the expense of fluency. And I think that's the balance that we need to try to achieve. It's not fluency at the expense of accuracy, or accuracy at the expense of fluency. And I would also argue that this could lead to serious fluency problems and potentially even inhibit meaningful opportunities for interaction in the language. And of course, the grammar teacher. We talked about this. Language awareness could also have a negative effect on teachers, especially those that have very high language awareness. So as teachers, we may need to resist the temptation to lecture students on language, talking about language. It's important for teachers to bear in mind the notion that learners should speak in the language. I'm going to go back to this. Talk in the language, not talking about the language. So when you go back to your classroom, or if you're teaching online for the next couple of months, one thing you might want to do is, am I asking my students to talk about the language, or am I asking them to talk in the language? So that would be a very good reflective task for you to conduct throughout the next couple of weeks as you are teaching online. So how can we reach a middle ground? Mike, you want to get to this, or should I keep going here? I'll keep going.
Okay, no, I was on the other one. I was on the previous slide. That one.
Okay.
But that's fine. We've already touched on these points.
Okay,
yeah.
So what is good language teaching then? I think that's the last question. So according to Leach, the mature communicative knowledge of grammar required by a teacher is this: a teacher should be able to, or should be capable, I should say, of putting across a sense of how grammar interacts with lexis. And I think this is something that Michael Birch said, this idea of lexical grammar. It's not grammar isolated from lexis. I think the two are intertwined. Again, the ability to analyze grammatical problems that our students might encounter, the ability and the confidence to evaluate the use of grammar by learners. Against what criteria? Of accuracy, appropriateness, and expressiveness. And depending on what you're teaching, I would even add complexity. Because one of the things I've noticed, especially with English for academic purposes, is that because a lot of these students have been exposed to general English, they write in a very simple way. Mike, you can say a lot more about this as well.
Yeah, I think
that complexity.
Yeah, I think it's a case of I think Michael Birch might have talked a little bit about this. It's basically exposure to, we talked a little bit about discourse analysis. So here you're looking at academic discourse analysis. So you have the students who are coming in knowing how to write, as you said, Leo, in general terms, but they're not familiar with the genre writing that they need to write in, say, academic, like paragraph writing. If you ask your students to write a paragraph, it can be quite challenging, because they might have, if you look at the letter D, they might have an idea of what a paragraph looks like in their own language. But when you look at academic English, at academic writing at an English medium university, a paragraph structure might be quite different. And I think that's it, that you're adding that additional level of complexity.
I would add, Michael, and I think everyone, you can also chime in the chat. A lot of academic teaching, English for academic purposes, is also talking about the language. What is a topic sentence? All my students, I think our students, can talk about they can describe a topic sentence, but can they write a topic sentence? Most of the time, they can't. They can't write a proper topic sentence, right?
What's the first sentence of an introduction? A hook.
A hook. Okay.
What's a hook? A shocking statement. Okay. An interesting question. Okay, write one. Right. Okay.
They can't, and they can't write. Again, because we spend too much time talking about the language and not really getting them to analyze language and giving them models. We're not giving our students models, good models.
Yeah, and I would also argue, and again, maybe this is getting a little off topic, but for those of you that are teaching academic writing, one thing that definitely Leo and I and Andrew, we've all heard, is that our students are learning the skills of academic writing and academic patterns, but when they enter their discipline courses, they're saying that they have to write an essay, and then they're coming back, or write a report, and they're coming back and saying, well, how do I write a report? And it comes back to what you said. It's a matter of complexity, but a lot of these programs are very intensive. So you're jamming down like how to write a research report in, say, 3 to 6 weeks. So there's not enough time to really focus on the transferability of these patterns and whatnot. So you're talking not only about it, but you're not actually giving them, as you said, Leo, enough models and then enough time to transfer those patterns across a variety of subject areas. Yeah.
I'm going to invite Andrew, because I saw the word cheesecake in the chat, and I don't know what the conversation is all about there, but can you share with
like
everyone?
cheesecake. That's pretty much it. Yeah.
What are people talking about there?
No, there was a question about how many hours it takes for a student to become fluent.
Forever.
And well, what does fluent mean, right? So we're talking about, it depends. And I use an analogy of going to the gym. So how many days do you have to go to the gym to lose 10 pounds? You can go to the gym in the morning, but if you eat a cheesecake every night, what's going to happen?
Okay.
Right? So for students to become fluent, they have to put in the work.
But it's lifelong learning as well, right? I think I saw someone mention that, right? Like, there is no proficient. Yeah, there is no speaker who's completely proficient in any language, right?
Yeah.
It's this continual phase of lifelong learning.
Right? I would also say this, I think this is the problem with language teaching, but also with the way we perceive things. Our society is very outcome oriented. It's all about the results. Nobody really enjoys the process. I'll give you an example. It might take you a month to lose 10 pounds, but you might gain those 10 pounds back if you don't change the way you exercise, if you don't change your mentality, your mindset. But if you go to the gym to lose 10 pounds, once you lose the 10 pounds, what happens? You stop going to the gym. You haven't developed the effective habits, as opposed to, you know what? I'm going to go to the gym because I want to be healthy. I think that's a much better goal, because being healthy is a process. It's not something that ends. And I think that's the problem with a lot of the way English has become commodified. And I had this conversation with Vini, is that it's all about selling English as a product with an end in mind. I think our job as teachers is to actually get our students to change the way they think about learning. And if they're able to switch from, I want to become fluent in English, as opposed to, I want to enjoy learning a language, I think that's the way to go. Anyway, there's a lot of messages here, but let's wrap it up here. So let's think about any final thoughts, any questions. Some students are too lazy for that. I agree, but that's where you kind of like work with them. I'm the laziest person I know. We're all lazy in a way. I'm lazy too, but I force myself to do things that I don't like doing. And I think that's what we want to get our students to do, is to get them to understand that it's actually possible to do those things.
Yeah, I agree, Leo. And I think, and I'm also guilty of being lazy, so I'm not gonna try and come off. But what was I gonna say? I think it comes back to removing this extrinsic motivation. I'm gonna learn it so I get whatever it is in your respective schools. I'm going to learn English until I get a level 8 or an IELTS 7. Right? Like, you have to remove that extrinsic motivator and replace it with something intrinsic. You know, how do you want to perform in the language? What target community do you want to enter? I'm sure when Andrew was learning Spanish, he wanted to be able to probably chat with other Costa Ricans in a bar and chill out. That was his target community. So he had that intrinsic motivation. And I think the lazy students definitely, you know, for me, like you mentioned, becoming healthy, yeah, it's really tough to get up and force myself to go to the gym. But it's like, well, what kind of life do I want to have, right? And at the end of the day, it's an intrinsic thing. And we have to be careful, because we don't want to force our own goals on our students or force feed them English. I know it's easy for me to say because I'm in Canada and I'm a white guy who speaks English and was born into an English household. But but I think, you know, if people don't want to learn the language and they're forced to learn the language, it is a tough one. So I empathize with a lot of the teachers out there who are dealing with that. However, again, tapping into their psychology, trying to connect with them. Without rapport, you'll never solve any of these problems, because without rapport, you can't conduct proper needs analysis, and then you can't figure out how to get them into that.
Well,
target
interesting
community.
comments here. Rebecca said, yeah, we all believe in laziness, but I think that most of the time we do not give the credits or maybe the benefit of the doubt. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
If I could just add on to that, I agree with everything that Mike just said. And for me, in my Spanish experience, like I was zero, nothing, right? And it was super intimidating. I was like, oh my God, how long is it going to take me to be able to go to a bar and talk to somebody or something? But I just made a plan for myself. Okay, well, tomorrow I'm going to do this. And the day after, I'm going to do this. So I made like a daily plan for myself. And it made it less intimidating. Whereas, okay, 2 years from now, maybe I'm going to be here, but tomorrow I'm going to do this. That helped me.
Michael said, what was her name, Andrew?
Well,
but you see, that's an example of motivation. I don't remember where I read this, but what students really need is what we call the, maybe I'll do a session, maybe we can do a webinar on this, but it's what we call the 7 C's. Like, they need to have a very clear conception of what they want. They need to have a very vivid a vision, a goal that is clearly imagined. Like you, Andrew, like I want to see myself doing this in the language. I want to see myself presenting in front of people. That would be the first thing. So I'm going to type this in the chat. So the first thing would be students need a clear conception. That would be the first one. The second one is confidence, a strong confidence that you can actually attain that goal, right? Because if you don't believe you can do it, then who's going to believe it, right? Concentration, I think that's another important one. Focused concentration on what it takes to reach the goal, right? I usually tell my students, if you leave my class and you're feeling tired, it's because you were actually focused. If they're bored, it means they were on their phone. That means you were doing something wrong. To me, when my students are on the phone, it's not a sign that they are lazy, you know, or that they're bored. It's a sign that there is something that I'm doing that is not good enough. So I always look at myself and I try to give them the benefit of the doubt. And again, consistency, that's the other C. Students, learners, everyone, we need to have this stubborn consistency in pursuing this goal, in pursuing this vision. And of course, commitment, right, to the importance of what you're doing. If you're not committed, then, Mike, we talk a lot about this. We try to practice what we preach. Everything that we say is things that we do. So if you tell your students, here's an example. You can't tell your students that you're going to teach them presentation skills if you've never done a presentation in your life, right? There's got to be accountability from the teacher. If the student sees that the teacher is accountable and is holding the learner accountable, then I think we have something. And I think the last two would be character, right? You need to have a good character to guide yourself, to keep you in the proper, to keep you on the proper course of action. And finally, capacity. You need to be able to enjoy the process along the way. So
I would add one more there, Leo.
There's another.
I think
is it with C?
Yeah, yeah. I think you need I'm gonna have to change this. A compassionate interlocutor or a community of practice. I think you need that social element, right?
Yes.
Because again, I think someone brought it up. You don't know what you don't know, right? So you need something to fill that that next stage of development, or that fill in that zone of proximal development.
Yeah.
So very.
I'm gonna
interesting stuff.
Let me go back here to the slide, sorry, just so people have asked for references. So just some of the references, I would say, if you want to learn more about the interface, the Kaiser has good stuff, beyond focus on form. Ellis talks a lot about explicit knowledge. It's not bedtime reading, just so you guys know, but we can share this. What else is good here? Robinson also talks a lot about the different types of learning. But let's move on. What else do we have here? Thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you want to get in touch with us, you can always send us an email, info@learnyourenglish.com. You can listen to our podcast, all the different platforms, Spotify, Podbean, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, you name it. We have a mailing list. If you want to be part of our mailing list, once a month, we don't bombard your emails on a daily basis with promotions or anything. We just send you one email per month with a lot of the research that we're doing. And we share a lot of the research with educators because, as Michael and Andrew have said, our job is not here. We're not here to tell you how to teach. We're here to create a community where we have a group of people who are interested in becoming better at their own craft. We're not experts in anything. We're just here to help everyone enjoy the process. If you can always leave us a Google review. That's the only thing. That's the only kind of payment that we expect back. You can just go to Google and leave us a review. You can say that anything you want to say. You can criticize us, say good things, bad things, whatever rocks your boat. You can go to Linktree, Learn Your English, to learn more about all the services that we have. We have a Patreon jar. Canada is notorious for, or famous in this case, I should say, for services that have to be tipped. So if you feel like giving us a tip, you can just go to Patreon and leave
I thought you were going to say they're famous for buskers.
Buskers, yeah. It's kind of
the buskers are going to suffer. Actually, I mean, this is serious stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And finally, we have 2 more webinars coming up. We have a repeat of our session on Friday. We talked about using listening as input for an online lesson. So again, teaching a lesson that does not use a textbook, a lesson that focuses on everything that we kind of talked about here today in our webinar would be there. And on Wednesday and Friday, a little late, 8 p.m. Unfortunately, that's the only time we have available. Eastern time. So it would be, if you are in Europe, you do have to do the calculation. It would be like 1 o'clock. But again, we don't need to get up early in the morning to go to work, right? So it's all good. We're going to be doing a session on Wednesday and Friday. These are different, but this is not part 1. This is actually part 2. We just forgot to change the number there.
It's part 2.
Part 2. We're going to be looking at reading, how to teach a pedagogically sound lesson using only one reading text from the internet, no textbook, nothing. What else do we have here? We have courses. We have a free course. Right now, the first module is free. If you want to join us, just go on Thinkific. It's called Grammar for Teachers. We have about 3 modules. We're going to keep adding more modules to it. I think that's it. Let me see if there's anything else here. No, I think that's it. We're going to be offering a teacher membership. So we're going to do something in the future where once a month, we're going to have webinars with groups of teachers. We're going to have online courses for teachers, podcasts, among other things for teachers. And if we have any questions, I mean, we can still take a few more questions if anyone has. Oh, it's midnight in the UK. Yeah. Working much more. I feel like a glass of whiskey, maybe.
Yeah, that sounds good. That's my fault for that one. Sorry, folks. Yeah. You can blame that one on Mike.
Yeah, we have recorded this, so we might, we're going to be putting this up soon. Andrew is going to be in charge of that. But yeah, we might be, I'm so sad I can't join you tomorrow. It's okay. It's okay. Alan in Guangzhou, China.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, we did that for the crew, the audience in Asia, because we were putting these on at weird times. So I thought a little bit later might help those in Japan and China like yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. We will
not great, but it's still.
Yeah. We will have the presentation up on YouTube. Teach more online courses. Do you have any company recommendations or companies that we should avoid? That's a good question. Many scams out there nowadays. Yeah, I agree. I don't know. Any companies? Anybody has? I think somebody was putting together a document for companies that you shouldn't work for. I think, yeah, I don't know. I would say just start your own company. Don't rely on other companies, especially the VIP kids, ABC kids, Gugu Dada kids, all these companies. I think you should just start with 1 or 2 students and then word of mouth. Build your own company. I think that would be my advice. I wouldn't I wouldn't rely on a lot of these companies. I kind of want to have people's microphones if they want to say something. I've done this with my lesson this morning, and I kind of want to hear people's voices. I don't know if anybody wants to say something. Just tell me, and I will unmute you. Or nobody wants to say anything. Yes, Lorenzo said BYOB, be your own boss. That's it. Yeah, or bring your own booze.
I suppose, Leo, I suppose people could probably just unmute themselves and
oh yeah,
they?
That's true.
And
that's
yeah,
true.
That's fine.
I mean, they can ask us a question. It's not like we have anywhere to go tomorrow.
I asked the question about the online teaching just for the fact that there are so many companies out there scam. I've heard people not getting paid and things like that. And I'm really fascinated with this field. So I'm teaching for Link Canada part-time.
Okay.
And I'm like, I want to do more. But there's so many companies out there that you can't trust. So I just thought I'd ask to see if you've heard some good ones or some bad ones that we could have look at, because I would like to learn as I go as well.
I would say, Sharon, a lot of the companies that I know of, you're basically teaching kids. You're teaching like from kindergarten to grade 6, grade 8. And from what I've seen, a lot of it is you're not really teaching, you're entertaining the kids. So if you're into this idea of, holding up a puppet and,
No.
entertaining kids, then I would say stay away from those companies.
Okay.
And not to mention the fact that a lot of them are very there's a lot of native speakerism. So a lot of them would say, oh, if your first language is not English, you should not apply for this job. And we're completely against that kind of approach to language teaching. So I would say start your own business. As Lorenzo said, yeah, be your own business. I think you should start creating a very simple website. Andrew might eventually one day do a session on how to create a website using Squarespace, because he's very good at it. And sure. I mean, a lot of teachers that I know that are here, they probably work for themselves. They don't work for schools. They work for themselves. They have built their own business. And I think
wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Anybody here who was an autonomous teacher? You don't work for schools or companies. You work for yourself. Please tell us. We own Twin VIP.
Yeah, it looks like some other people have some connections there as well.
Yeah,
Sharon.
Roberta.
So
Roberta
just
has,
keep your eye on the chat. Yeah.
So Sharon, maybe you want to contact Roberta or Renata. Wait a second. Renata and Roberta are sisters, I guess, or cousins, or
co-workers.
I met you last year in Curitiba. They're twins. Oh, okay. Nice. So yeah, maybe get in touch with them. Eventually, we would like to create like some sort of a forum for teachers with jobs. And eventually what we want to do as well is we want to recruit students and then hire teachers to work with us. That's kind of what we foresee in the future.
Yeah, Sharon, hopefully when we do get to that point, then hopefully we will be in a position to take on some extra teachers. But yeah. That's something we're developing as well. But we have a very specific way that we like to teach, and we're very passionate about how we see the classroom, and both online and face to face. And I think for us, it felt like it was easier for us to just start our own company than work for someone else. But Leo makes a good point. It does take some, and Andrew could comment on this. There's something to be said, like maybe teachers shouldn't be learning all the stuff they learn in a TESOL program. Maybe they should be learning how to become entrepreneurs as well, right? Like a mixture of both, right? Yeah. How to brand yourself as a teacher to do online lessons. And so
I think that's the playbook that a lot of teachers are sold, right? It's like, oh, you teach. This is what I don't like a lot about I don't like a lot of these courses because they're very prescriptive in nature. CELTA is very prescriptive. Delta to a certain extent. But they're basically telling you have to teach following this set of behaviors. You have to do things in a certain way, as opposed to actually getting teachers to reflect on how they teach, on the things that they do in the classroom. I think that's the kind of approach that we take to teacher education. We're not here, and we've said this, we're not here to tell you how to teach. We're here to learn more about how you do things And we're here to question, like, why do you teach this way? Why do you do it this way? Why do you think it works best this way? And for us is collect data. If something is working, you have to collect some sort of data. Maybe students writing, maybe they're speaking, something that actually shows you that what you're doing is actually working, rather than just going through the wheels or the motions of a textbook, right?
And that's going to be the community that we're trying to develop, or we're hoping to develop, is just having those discussions and having those interactions and reflecting on teaching. But to go back to your point, Leo, about being your own boss and entrepreneurship, I don't think that's teaching specific. I just think the world is moving in that direction, and online work in lots of fields will be, I mean, especially now, and after all this, what's going on now gets resolved and things go back to normal, I think online work will be pretty popular. So as teachers, I mean, we can certainly work online with companies, but I think we all have students, we all have a base of people that we can work with, and hopefully our community serves as something where we can all come together and share ideas and have projects together.
Some questions here. So what do you recommend we do to improve as teachers? Well, attend our webinars. Just kidding.
Join our mailing list? No.
Well, I don't mean to toot my own horn, but I think we're very good at what we do. We're very passionate about what we do. We're not here to tell you how to teach. But things that you can do to improve as a teacher is, I think, as I said, try different things. Learn something and then try to apply that in the classroom, as opposed to just kind of going through the motions of a textbook. I find that the teachers that I know that are good at what they do, they don't use textbooks. And I'm not saying that teachers who use textbooks are bad, but what I'm saying is teachers who do not rely on textbooks so much are able to experiment more. They're not chained, they're not slaves to the textbook. They know how to look at a textbook and say, you know what, I'm going to use this one activity, and I'm going to be able to create an entire lesson out of one simple activity of a textbook. Mike.
No, sorry to interrupt. I just saw another question come up about courses. I again, like not to toot our own horn, but I really would encourage you all to check out the Grammar for Teachers. It's a free module. We worked really hard on that, and again, it's coming from a genuine place. Like, these are all issues that we as teachers needed, areas that we needed to develop. So we thought, while we're developing, let's create a course. So in terms of courses we have available now, I think that I would encourage everyone who's participating in this workshop to at least check it out and to have a look. It's free. And again, we worked quite hard on it from the standpoint as, if we were a teacher, what would we want to know? What did we struggle with? And the other thing I would say about what can we do to improve? I think we're all at very, very different points of a very long continuum of teaching. And I know that, and I've learned a lot of this from Leo, and the value of journaling and just scheduling. And this goes back to habits. Just after you teach a lesson, schedule 5 minutes and just force yourself to write down like 2 or 3 things of what went well, or even just what popped up in the lesson that really kind of resonated or made you think or made you pause. And those are oftentimes the best starting points for development. And just that little bit of reflection can then lead to maybe, again, this kind of dialogue during a webinar, or you're talking to a colleague and they had the same thing and they tell you about an article that they've read or a webinar that they've attended, and it goes from there. I don't think there's any prescription, but I do think, again, you'll hear me saying intrinsic motivation a lot. I think that if we really want to be serious about learning or getting healthy, it comes from self-reflection, being vulnerable, noticing that you don't know something, and then being proactive and seeking out. Again, being embracing a sense of inquiry, right?
You stole my answer, man.
No.
Because I was just going to say, just really simply for me, I try and take my own advice. Things that I recommend that my students do, I try to do for myself. So we're trying to get students to have exposure and to take initiative to engage in the language outside of the classroom. And I try to do the same thing. So again, Leo likes to say we practice what we preach. So I like to say that.
Yeah, and just to add on, because Leo, and maybe you can follow up on this. Leo and I Leo's just finishing off his his graduate program, and I'm still going through one of my programs. And you know, we talked about academic writing a lot, and that we were never taught it. And but the motivation is I want to be a good writer. So how do I do that? I have to look at models, and I have to teach myself, and I have to, as you said, Andrew said, proactively go out and seek advice on my writing. And sometimes it's brutal, but again, it's that self-embodiment. What do I want to be, right? What was it, Leo? The concept?
Conception, confidence, concentration, consistency, commitment, character, and capacity. Pitakus actually said this: know your opportunity. I take a more philosophical approach to things, but just to segue into this, what Mike said and Andrew said, Lorenzo asked, when did you decide to come together and create Learn Your English? What made you come up with this idea? Did you know each other already? It's interesting because I started Learn Your English because I was unhappy with the current state of language teaching in Canada. I was very unhappy working for schools in Canada. And I said, you know what? I'm going to say a bad word here. I said, fuck it. I don't want to work for these schools anymore. I don't believe in what I'm doing. I don't think I'm getting better as a teacher. So I decided to start Learn Your English. And it was just mostly for students. And then eventually I started teaching at a university in Canada, in Toronto. And I met Mike and Andrew. And then they're like, hey, I saw your website. I saw Learn Your English. Can we just get together and do something? And then eventually became a completely different beast that it is what you see now. And this is our, second year now together as a company. And why did we come up with this? We just want to get better. We just want to be better at what we do. For us, we don't think that teaching, that we will become, you know, perfect teachers. We know that we have flaws. We know that there are areas that we always need to work on. So working together at Ryerson, at a university here, we eventually were very unhappy at some point. I'm going to say it, I don't care. It's fine. We were very unhappy with the curriculum. We were very unhappy with the way things were done there. And we were like, you know what, let's just quit and do our own thing. And that's what we're doing now. It's scary. I'll say this to everyone. It's very scary to work for yourself, to have your own business. But I'm going to say that you should always strive to do things that make you scared, because everything on the other side of fear is usually beautiful. And I'm not saying that just because, but I find that instead of goal setting, I think we should be focusing more on fear setting. What are you afraid of? Oh, I'm afraid of teaching without a textbook. Then do it. Oh, I'm afraid of trying this new idea. Then do it, because that's the only way you will develop.
And if you want to learn how to teach online without a textbook, tomorrow night.
Yes.
Listening part 2 or part 1, repeated.
We're repeating part 1. Yeah. Roberta said, what about attending a course in your school? If so, which one? We might be offering classes in Toronto over the summer. Eventually, whenever the COVID-19 disappears, which might be a couple of years from now, but we don't know. Renata said we are good and we can notice the passion. Thank you, Renata.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think just going back to the course thing, I think the goal here is to get into a membership, and that basically we would.
We want a community, right, Mike? We want a group of people that want to work together and improve.
Again, lessons have this sense of finality to it, which is not what we want. We want a community.
And we're building that right now, but we're also working with schools. So if your school,
that's true.
If your school would be interested, and we do online training for bigger groups. So if your school might be interested, maybe let them know. They can get in touch with us or whatever, and that could be a possibility as well.
Another question here from Danilo: where can I subscribe to the mailing list? I haven't found on the website.
I put the link there.
Join our community.
Just on the homepage, join our community. Just fill in your name, your email, and that's it.
Rebecca said, I worked as a prof at a college and recently moved to a language school. What I did a lot was peer observation and also survey with my students. Yes, based on that, I've been just trying here and there and taking some notes, especially on what didn't work and why. Yes, that's basically what Michael was saying, right? Taking this reflective approach to, excuse me.
Mm-hmm. And I think, just because, yeah, I just to jump in there, I think that observation is so underappreciated, or it's rushed. Here, you watch these 4 lessons. There, now you've watched enough. But I think that's not it. And this often comes up with theory. People often always ask. I think it came up in this discussion today. Was what's the connection between theory in the classroom and actually theory and observation? I think are key, because if you can understand or know, have access or know the theory, and then you have the opportunity to watch, not just watch the teacher, but watch the students, watch how they're behaving, then from that you'll have more flexibility in terms of your own classroom, right? Because you'll not only know the theory, but you'll see how it kind of comes out, emerges in the classroom, and then you can draw your own kind of techniques and activities and practice that you want to do in the classroom. So if you have that opportunity, like Leo, like Andrew said, of course, we would love to work with your schools and design something. But I would just say, in that same conversation, I would say that you should bring up with your director that you'd like more opportunities to observe other classes, because I'm a big proponent of observation and the reflection.
Yeah, Michael said communities like this are also invaluable. Yeah. What does PWWP stand for? Practice what you preach. Oh,
practice what you preach.
Yeah.
Practice what we preach.
Yes. Together we're strong. Yes. How do I find your course on Thinkific? Andrew have already added the link. The curriculum simply doesn't correspond to how languages are learned. I agree. A lot of the curriculum, a lot of curriculum is designed by people who actually have no experience with curriculum design. Okay, so that's the number one problem for me, is who designed this curriculum? Okay, what experience do they have with curriculum design? 0. Okay, so why should you design the curriculum then? What else? Oh, one thing, just to add to
curriculum around a textbook.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh yeah, they call the textbook the curriculum. Textbooks are not curriculum, by the way, just so you know. Or they say, what approach do you teach? Oh, I teach using the the what is it called, that textbook?
American English File.
No, not the American English File. The other one. Interchange. New interchange. I remember when I was in Mexico doing some training, a teacher said, Leo, I use the new interchange approach. I said, I've never heard of such approach. What is it? And he showed me the textbook. And I was like, oh, so the textbook is your approach. I see. But what I was going to say, just to add to what Michael and Andrew have said, take risks. I developed a lot as a teacher when I was just supply teaching. And I did that on purpose. I said, you know what, now that I'm unemployed, I'm just going to supply teach. So I would just jump into a classroom with no lesson plan, and I would just teach the students, not the lesson. That's one thing you can do. As Mike said, observation is key. Unfortunately, observation is just a way of assessing the teacher, making sure that he's ticking the boxes. But there's very little emphasis on improving the teaching. And the other question I have is, who is giving feedback on the assessor? How do we know that the assessor is actually qualified to be assessing the teacher, right? So that's the other.
Yeah, and just to, so to contextualize that, I meant teaching a teacher peer observation. So teachers watching teachers, But I think that's a great point. Yeah. The same person who's designing the curriculum, Leo.
Yes.
Is evaluating the teacher. Or the evaluating the observer.
Yeah, so I think that's the problem. Is like a lot of observations are just ticking the boxes, but not really helping teachers improve. And I think that for us as teachers, if we want to improve, we need to take we need to adopt a more critical approach to what we do. It's questioning why we do what we do in the way that we do. I think that's a question you should always ask yourself. Why do you pre-teach vocabulary? Oh, because my Delta tutor told me. But that's not a good reason for you to do that, right? Why don't you guys create material and sell it? Renat's a good question. We're still in the process of creating things. We're creating courses. We're designing a task-based language teaching course. We're going to be offering courses as well online. We're still playing around because in Canada, I'm not sure if I should say this, but I will. in Canada, we don't know how the market reacts to online learning yet, especially teachers. But it's good to know that Sharon is from Canada, and she seems to be enjoying herself. I don't know who else here would be interested, but we're definitely going to be offering more courses online for teachers. We really want to do this. We really want to find a way to give back to people. And this is why we're doing this for free, because we just want people to know what we're doing. And yeah. Miranda says she wants practical materials. Yeah, we're definitely doing that. If you go to a website, you can actually buy some of the materials that we've designed. We don't design a lot of materials. We design materials for schools who contact us and say, Leo, we would like you guys to design an entire curriculum for our pre-intermediate level. And we design the curriculum, we do the training for you. We help your teachers teach that way. But what we really want people to do is we want them to tell us more about their context so we can help. We're not here to tell you, this is how you should do it. No, tell us about your context, and together we can build the materials together. I think that's better. Marcia said you can help teachers in many different parts of the world with online courses. Thank you, Marcia. It's good to know that people would be interested in this. We're still kind of like surveying the market. Mike.
Yeah, just to add on what Leo just said there is what we usually do with schools is, for example, they'll come in and they'll say, listen, we teach EAP, but our teachers have expressed some concerns about teaching, I don't know, report writing or maybe graduate level type writing where you need an expertise, certain level of expertise or certain higher level of language awareness or discourse analysis. So what we've been doing is we've been going in and designing a training course just for like teaching graduate writing or teaching EAP for undergraduates. And as Leo said, we work through those, not only in terms of here's what a sample lesson would look like, but here's how you teach that lesson in a way that is more conducive to learning. So where again, you're often given a textbook, read the teacher's notes. No, we kind of get away from that. We again find out what your context is, and then based on that, we design the training materials. And again, it's sometimes it's 10 hours of online training, or most recently it's been with schools in Toronto, so it's been face to face. But again, it could go now. We're working on a annual subscription, so schools are signing up and they would be running that EAP training course throughout the year. So rather than just 10 hours, it would be extended. So again, you have that continuous, because again, we practice what we preach. It's not a one-off, it's a continual, it's a spectrum, right? And we're big on that, and we make sure that that's what we provide, not just a one-off training session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's it, guys. We've been here for 2.5 hours. Yeah.
Okay.
It's time to say goodbye to everyone. We'd love to stay a little longer, but beautiful. All right, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks,
Enjoy
everyone.
your Sunday. The rest of
Thank
your
you.
Sunday, I guess. Yeah. All right. Take care, everyone.
Yeah.